Well, good evening. My name is John Nicholas. Welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park, and welcome to this evening's Campfire program. What's going to follow isn't necessarily the experience of every Civil War soldier that served during the war. Some men never fired a shot in anger. Some never saw the enemy. Some worked at the great logistics centers like Cairo, Illinois, or Richmond, or City Point. And some, the Civil War is a lot different than what you're going to hear tonight. At 5:30 in the morning on June 3rd, 1864, the Union armies operating against Richmond under the command of Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant launched an attack on Confederate lines at Cold Harbor, Virginia, just 10 miles east of Richmond. Depending on the account that you read, the Union Army suffered between 4,000 to maybe as many as 7,000 casualties about an hour, most of them during the first 20 minutes. The night before this disaster, one of General Grant's aides, Horace Porter, was walking to the camp of the Union regiment. From a distance, Porter saw that many of the soldiers were sitting around sewing. He thought this was an odd thing to do the night before a big battle. He would have expected the men to be writing last letters home, praying, trying to get some sleep, or looking at their equipment, anything but sewing. But as he got closer, he saw what they were really doing. They'd written their names and addresses on pieces of paper, or sewing them to the backs of their uniform coats so they could be identified the next morning after they were killed. These were men who were looking directly into the face of death and facing their own mortality and existence. Unlike the movies, there's nothing glamorous or glorious about this. Now, why would they do this? So this is a program about these men, how they experienced Army life and combat, and finally what happened to them after the war was over. At the start of the Civil War, the regular United States Army had slightly more than 16,000 soldiers spread all across the continent. It would increase to about 28,000 during the war. Confederate armies didn't even exist yet. Yet over 2.2 million men would serve in Union armies during the war, and almost 1 million would serve in Confederate armies. Most of them were state volunteers. They enlisted for a variety of reasons. Now, why men joined the armies could be a whole separate program by itself, much beyond the scope of this program. Wars start for a reason. You just don't wake up one morning and decide you're going to invade Poland or the Ukraine, or where the Civil War almost started in 1849, New Mexico territory. Often wars have multiple causes. The American Civil War, preserving the Union, preventing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, protecting slavery, ending slavery, following the footsteps of their grandfathers who had fought in the Revolution. Tariffs, states' rights, gaining or losing political power, girls, money, boredom, curiosity, fun, and because everybody else was doing it, were all reasons why men enlisted in 1861. Now, later in the war, some men would be drafted. Confederacy starts the very first draft in April of 1862. They started out drafting 18 to 35-year-old men. 5 months later, they're drafting 18 to 40-year-old men. February of 1864, they're drafting 17-year-old boys to 50-year-old men. And the last year of the war, they're drafting 13-year-old boys all the way up to 60-year-old men. And the draft was pretty popular on both sides. If you owned 20 more slaves, you could get out of the draft, though. That meant you were worth at least $660,000. And Richmond on the north and the south could also hire substitutes to go in their place. This led to saying that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. But as I said, the draft was very unpopular on both sides. But that's not you. You're one of the original volunteers of 1861. Now, many, probably all of them, had unrealistic views of what Army life would be like, as this soldier did. Most had never been more than 25 miles away from home and thought it'd be fun and exciting. They wanted to see the elephant. Seeing the elephant when the circus came to town was something that was rare, unusual, and exciting. It was also a euphemism for experiencing war. These men thought if they could just get into this thing, it would be the greatest experience of their lives, something they could always brag about for the rest of their lives when they returned home. And every one of them thought they would be returning home. Nobody thought the war would last long. A few weeks, a few months, it'd all be over. It'd be over by Christmas. They've been saying that ever since Christmas started, I think, and in fact they were saying it in 2003. Nobody on either side, except for a few professional soldiers, believed there was a need for any type of military training. This is this common belief on both sides. If you led a virtuous life, that if you didn't drink, smoke, gamble, or swear, if you were a good church-going man, all you had to do is show the enemy how brave you are, and those bullets would just fly past you. Now, a few of them would hit some of the sinners behind you, but most of the sinners on the other side, so that's why our side's going to win. Soldiers very quickly found out, though, that it was the virtuous and brave who were usually the first ones killed. So you've joined a company, about 100 other recruits, who are all your friends and neighbors and relatives from back home. And you're sent to a camp of instruction where you're going to learn how to be a soldier. Your company becomes part of a regiment with other companies from your state. That regiment will be assigned to a brigade with anywhere from 2 to 8 regiments. Very quickly, almost immediately, upon arriving at the camp of instruction, the new recruits were getting sick. The measles, smallpox, chickenpox, diarrhea, typhoid, yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery. Disease was responsible for two-thirds of the deaths suffered during the Civil War and killed more men than bullets. The disease would keep killing men all throughout the war. You didn't think it would be like this. When you reach the camp of instruction, you find out there are people telling you what to do. And these people are called officers. And these officers are people you know from back home, whom you go elected as your colonel, lieutenant colonel, major, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, and now they're giving you orders telling you what you can and cannot do. Who do they think they are? I'm not going to do it. Well, if you don't want to follow orders, the Army had ways of instilling discipline in you. If you wanted to straggle or leave camp without permission, you might find yourself riding the wooden horse for 12 hours. Not a very comfortable ride. If you made the very serious mistake of talking back to an officer, you could find yourself bucked and gagged like this for 10 hours a day for up to 2 weeks at a time. You're not going to talk back if you sit like this for a while. And if you were tempted to steal, especially as some farmer's hog or his chickens, you would find yourself wearing the wooden overcoat like this young man. There's a good reason for you to be tempted to steal, because the farmer's chickens much better than the food that the Army was serving you. But that's okay, because you're not going to spend a lot of time eating anyway. What you will be doing is drilling, learning to march, moving as a group, first with your company, then with your regiment, and later with your brigade. Discipline and training were very important to the success of the regiment and a brigade. The best brigades during the Civil War, like the famous Iron Brigade, the Union Army of the Potomac, or Hood's Texas Brigade and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, are famous for their toughness and fighting ability. They were the best because they had good leadership, who right from the very beginning set the example, shared in the hardships of their men, ensured their soldiers were disciplined, but also that they were well trained and well taken care of. Ironically, at the beginning of the war, most regiments spent very little time learning how to load and shoot their muskets. Armies had used firearms for almost 250 years prior to the Civil War. The primary weapon that the soldier fought with for at least the first year war and even longer was a single-shot, smoothbore musket. The musket was very inaccurate and only had an effective range of about 80 yards. And soldiers learned how to fight standing shoulder to shoulder in a battle line. Just a couple months ago, I had a man come up to the Park Information Desk and he said, "What were they thinking in the Civil War? They should have been fighting like George Washington did, Indian style, like they did in the Revolution." Well, George Washington and his men didn't really fight Indian style during the Revolution. In fact, they were losing a lot of battles till Baron von Steuben came from Prussia, talking how to be soldiers in the European style. And today we think this is unusual to stand shoulder to shoulder like this and fight, but it would be unusual to these soldiers right here. Soldiers had fought like this for 2,000 years, first with spears and swords, then with pikes, then with arrows, and finally with firearms. And so these things don't really change over the night. You're not going to change. You've been doing this for 2,000 years. Why would you change everything now? The inaccuracy of the musket and its slow rate of fire meant that for the weapons to be effective, the commander needed to synchronize and maximize the firing of as many muskets as possible to send a wall of lead down range towards the enemy. Even with inaccurate weapons, if you had enough people massed together shooting at another large group of people who are also massed together, somebody would eventually get hurt. There's just no other way to do it. You couldn't communicate with your soldiers if you were spread out over a couple hundred yards hanging behind rocks and trees. This was one of the reasons why the Confederate attacks on Culp Hill and Little Round Top failed. Confederate lines were broken up into small groups by the terrain until there was no way to mass firepower or coordinate attacks. As one Texan said later of the fight on Little Round Top, every officer and every private was his own general. Now they knew that if they rifled their muskets, if they cut spiral grooves in the barrels of the muskets, that would greatly increase the range and accuracy of the weapon. The problem was the musket ball had to fit very tightly in the barrel in order for the rifling to work. This made it very hard to load the rifle after 4 or 5 shots. But then a French army captain by the name of Claude Manet solved the problem by inventing a new type of ammunition called the Manet Ball, the mini ball that you see here. If you look at it, it's not a round musket ball. It was made smaller than the barrel, but it had a cup in the back. When you fired the musket, explosion from the gunpowder expanded that cup and caught the rifling in the barrel. Now you could shoot out accurately to, in theory, at least 1,000 yards. Because of the enormous number of casualties that occurred during the Civil War, there's this myth that those casualties were due to the increased range and accuracy of the rifled musket and the mini ball. But the rifled musket and mini ball were not quite as accurate as people or as effective as people think they were. Here at Gettysburg on Culp's Hill, listen to this number, over 1,526,000 rounds of ammunition were fired between July 1st and July 3rd. The total number of casualties on both sides was about 3,400. Obviously, a lot of people were not hitting the people they were shooting at. And if you look back 50 years earlier to the Napoleonic Wars, you see the casualty rates that dwarf the American Civil War. And 50 years earlier, the standard infantry weapon was the smooth musket, which only had a maximum effective range of about 80 yards. Yet look at these numbers: 35,000, 47,000, 57,000, 73,000, 127,000. There's this false belief also that on both sides, the armies were armed with rifled muskets from the very start of the war. But nothing could be further from the truth. In the first year of the war, armies on both sides had a hard enough time just arming their soldiers with any type of weapon. Rifled muskets were in short supply and were only gradually acquired by the two armies, or by the armies. By late 1862, best equipped Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, was largely armed with rifled muskets. But even as late as Gettysburg in July 1863, 12% of that army were still using smoothbores. Lee's army in Northern Virginia wasn't primarily armed with the rifled muskets until after Chancellorsville in May of 1863. The other main Confederate army, the Army of Tennessee, wouldn't have rifled muskets until the Atlanta campaign. The war would end 12 months later. The rifled musket firing a mini ball doubled, tripled, even quadrupled the range that you could shoot at, but soldiers still faced a variety of problems. The amount of time it took to load the weapon, the lack of marksmanship training soldiers received, the dense vegetation that Civil War armies fought in here in North America, even denser smoke, and finally the excitement of combat negated much of the advantage of the longer range and accuracy. It wasn't that the rifled musket was effective, it was that it should have been more effective than it was. Most soldiers weren't taught how to estimate range, or adjust the weapon's sights, or how to compensate for wind speed and wind direction for targets that were beyond 150 yards. And for that reason, officers would not give the command to fire until the enemy was within 200 yards, with the additional order to aim low. Historian Earl Hess has estimated the average range of Civil War combat was actually around 127 yards, a distance that was not much greater than the smoothbore musket. So if the increased accuracy and range did increase the number of casualties, what did? First, the mini ball had a lower muzzle velocity than the old round musket ball. When the musket ball struck a bone, it broke. How many people die of broken bones? Not very many. With its lower muzzle velocity, though, when the mini ball struck a bone, it flattened out and shattered the bone. A shattered bone means amputation. And germ theory was still 15 years into the future. Surgeons didn't know about infection. They didn't wash their hands or clean their surgical instruments. So even if soldiers survived the first amputation, maybe looking at additional amputations, eventually that infection will have the opportunity to claim the soldier's life. Another factor was that for most of the war, soldiers usually fought in what is now called the standing unsupported firing position. The way the musket, for the most part, was supported by the muscles of the left arm. The arm wouldn't be able to hold the musket steady for long enough to make a very stable firing platform. But by 1864, more and more soldiers were fighting behind fortifications, which not only protected them from enemy fire, but also allowed them to rest in front of the musket on a log, which provided a much sturdier firing platform than relying on your muscles. Finally, a third reason the high casualty list during the Civil War was simple math. The American Civil War was the first war fought on the North American continent with mass armies of 50,000, 100,000, and 150,000 soldiers. More people, shooting at more people with more lethal weapons, usually means more people get hurt. If you're lucky, you've received a couple months of drilling and training, but usually it's only a couple of weeks. You're not getting much sleep, You're eating bad food and not eating much of that. You're dirty all the time. Learn to live with fleas, ticks, lice, flies, mosquitoes. Because the Army's an outdoor business, you're out in the rain, the snow, and in the scorching heat. Seeing friends get sick and going to the hospital and they don't come back. You didn't think it would be like this. Disease didn't kill you. Maybe boredom would, because every day it's the same monotonous drilling over and over and over and over again. And you and your friends all grumble, we don't need all this drilling. Just give us some muskets and let us fight. The days leading up to your first battle, you march 10, 20, maybe even 30 miles a day. Marching in columns with several thousand men along dirt roads. If the roads are wet, they'll soon turn to mud, several feet deep until they'll become impassable. If the roads are dry, huge clouds of choking dust, turned by thousands of marching feet, will hang in the air over the columns and you can barely see or breathe. Along the sides of the road, you see dozens, even hundreds of men who have fallen out because of the heat. Some of them have fainted. Some of them are dying of heat stroke, and some are already dead. Many in your own regiment are beginning to fall out. You didn't think it would be like this. Somehow, despite the miles and the dust and the heat, you managed to stay with your regiment. Every day, there are dozens of rumors, dozens of them. You replaced the next day by a whole new set of rumors. After a while, you become sick of hearing them and you don't know what to believe. You don't know where you're going, and neither does anyone else. One morning, as you're marching along another road, you hear what sounds like thunder. Maybe for a minute, you try and convince yourself that's what it is, thunder. Then you search your mind for some other explanation. It's got to be something else. It's got to be anything other than what you know it really is, and that's cannon fire. The officers tell you to pick up the pace and your heart begins pounding. After a few miles, you see civilian refugees coming towards you. Old people, women, crying children with a few belongings. They all tell you how terrible it is back there. You want to tell them everything will be all right. But you have doubts yourself, so you say nothing. As you approach the battlefield, you begin to see stragglers. These are soldiers who, for one reason or another, have left their regiments. Some claim to be sick. Some claim to be wounded, but look unhurt. Others are helping a wounded friend to the rear, and you can bet they're not going to be coming back. And some have just left. You notice that several men in your own regiment have suddenly disappeared. Soon, the campfire gets louder and louder, and your heart is beating faster and faster. Adrenaline is racing through your body, and you see farms with destroyed crops, broken fences, and dead livestock. Even if you're not a farm boy, this is pretty disturbing. As you get closer to the battlefield, you see something far, far worse. Now you're seeing the wounded, men who are somehow still alive, had a jaw shot away, their eyes shot out, men without arms, with a leg or a hand missing. Then you see the dead, bodies cut in half by artillery fire, bodies without heads, heads without bodies, bodies and parts of bodies mangled and pulverized in every possible way. There seem to be pools of blood everywhere, the ground slippery with it. You didn't know a human being had this much blood in them. You didn't think it would be like this. Suddenly you come under artillery fire. It comes out of nowhere and you can't see who's shooting at you. The enemy isn't aiming at you but at the troops on the front line, but they're overshooting their targets. Some of their shells are landing in your ranks. Men are being killed and wounded before they've even seen the enemy, and there's nothing they can do about it. The officers tell you to lie down and you hug the earth and you wish you could get underneath it. Finally the cannon stops shooting and you get up and begin moving again. And then you stop, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and it seems like forever. At this point, nobody is talking. Every soldier's lost in his own thoughts. Some, a lot of them are smoking, even the ones that didn't smoke before. Others are chewing on paper from a torn cartridge. Still others are looking at photographs of loved ones, reading a letter from home. You see a few men moving their lips in silent prayer. At last, orders come that it's time for your regiment to move up on the line, and another huge surge of adrenaline shoots to your body. You think, this is it. What you couldn't have imagined is now really happening. The officers tell you to load and cap your muskets and fix bayonets, but due to the adrenaline, you're having problems with your coordination. You're fumbling with your cartridge, you're dropping percussion caps, and suddenly you can't remember how to lock the bayonet in place. Finally, the regiment is ready to go, and the command, "Forward! March!" is given. Marching the column down the farm lane. As you move off the farm lane into a field, the regiment moves from a column into a line of battle. It seems so easy at the camp of instruction is now extremely difficult. Moving across a field that's been plowed, or if crops are planted, if the ground is rocky or marshy, is hard work. As you trample over the uneven ground, the battle line becomes broken and disordered, as if there was any order to ever begin with. A captain, with about 3 dozen soldiers, is ordered to move ahead as the skirmish line, sort of an early warning system to feel out the enemy and prevent a surprise attack. As you move onto the battlefield, the noise is deafening, and it doesn't look anything like it is in the picture books or paintings back home. Musket fire sounds like popping corn or hail on a roof. Artillery shells screech harmlessly overhead or explode above you, killing or wounding several men at a time. There's so much smoke you can barely see more than 100 yards in front of you. The one thing you can see are the colors, the symbols of your regiment. These battle flags were made and presented to you by the people back home. So not only do they represent your regiment and the bonds that connect you to your comrades, but they also represent home. You don't want to let those folks down. You know that even if you can't hear or see your officers, all you have to do is look for the colors. It's considered a great honor to be selected as the color bearer, to be part of the color guard. But it's also a death warrant, because the enemy knows if the colors go forward, so will your regiment. So the color bearers and the color guard become targets right away. Suddenly, you see the skirmishers come running back, and the command, "Halt!" is given. Next you hear somebody yell, "There they are!" And then through the smoke you see them, indistinct dark figures, and you're told that's the enemy. There's so much smoke it's almost impossible to tell who they are. Command is given to "Fire by volley!" Ready, aim, fire, and you pull the trigger and fire your musket. The butt of the musket slams in your shoulder, and you see some of those dark figures fall. Your officers yell, "Load!" And as you ram another cartridge down the barrel, a sheet of flame comes in that dark mass in front of you, and men around you, they don't fall. Dozens are knocked down as if hit by a wave. Command is again given to "Fire by volley!" Ready, aim, fire, and then load and fire at will. Now the musket fire is continuous. Fortunately, monotonous drilling that you had thought was so unnecessary is now taking over, and you load and shoot as fast as you can. You hear mini balls whiz past you. You hear the crack they make when they strike bone, or the dull thud when they strike human flesh. Men around you are yelling. Some are cursing. Some will cry out in agony, while others are killed or wounded without making a sound at all. The officers are moving up and down the line behind you, yelling, "Aim low! Aim low! Pour it into them, and give them hell!" Except that at this point you aren't aiming at all, because all you can see is this dense smoke in front of you, and all you can see are the flashes from the enemy's muskets. So you shoot at the flashes. The smoke burns your eyes and nose. You become disoriented. Your mouth becomes dry from tearing off paper cartridges, and your shoulders sore from the kick of your musket. Reflexes and adrenaline have taken over your body now, and time seems to slow down. Everything seems to be in slow motion, and more men are being killed and wounded around you. This was your father. This was your brother. These were your friends, but you barely notice. If you do, you have little time to think about this. Suddenly, the colonel of your regiment is killed only a few yards away from you. Then you see the colors fall. Men are starting to panic, and the battle line is wavering. You see soldiers leaving the line by 2s and 3s. But then a sergeant picks up the flag and begins waving it. And then the regiment rallies. The major takes command. The line holds. But for how long? For how long? After 20, 30, maybe 45 minutes, it's all over. Because the enemy has retreated, or you have. Or more likely, it's because your regiment has suffered so many casualties that it's no longer combat effective. As you come off the line, your body is shaking. Your body is shaking. You can't make it stop. You can't stop shaking. But then at last, the adrenaline that had been running through your body is used up. And you're physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. You're stunned. You can't quite understand what you've seen. For the dead, their battle is over. Maybe they can be identified and will get a decent burial, but usually the armies have to move on. They're more concerned with the living than the dead. So often even your own dead will have to be buried in large mass graves. Even if an individual grave is marked, often the markers are not permanent enough to last. Eventually, the soldier might become one of the 46% of the dead during the war to be eventually listed as missing or unknown. Many soldiers consider being wounded worse than being killed. A wounded soldier might lie on the battlefield for hours or even days, covered with flies and maggots, the heat or rain, with no food or water. If a wounded soldier is rescued, it meant a painful ride in an ambulance to a house or a barn being used as a field hospital, where he may again wait for hours before he sees the surgeon. A stomach wound means the surgeon probably won't even look at you. They can't repair the damage. A shattered limb means amputation. You know what that means. At the end of the war, battlefield medicine has improved so much that a wounded soldier would have a 75% survival rate if they made it to a surgeon. But afterwards, their future is uncertain. A soldier who is captured has a very grim future. Over 674,000 soldiers were captured during the Civil War and became prisoners of war. A soldier's chance of being killed on the battlefield was about 5%, while the chance of dying in a Civil War prison is about 13%. For black soldiers, the U.S. colored troops, that number shot up to 35%. That was if they made it to a prison, and many won't. They'll be shot, bayoneted, or hanged as soon as they're captured. Well, it wasn't the intention of either side. Due to poor planning, the number of men taken prisoner, overcrowding, disease, and public indifference, Civil War prison camps on both sides were little more than concentration camps, responsible for the slow, agonizing deaths of thousands of men. If you made it through this battle, you've been lucky, but you're severely depressed, and in your letters, you don't know how to describe what you've seen to the folks back home. You've been lucky. What about the next time? By 1864, in Virginia and around Atlanta, combat was continuous, with the only pause between fighting was marching to the next position to fight again. Soldiers became fatalistic about their chances of survival. They stopped saving money. They stopped writing home. They no longer talked about the future because it was something they could no longer imagine. If you were wounded and survived the operation but needed longer to recuperate, or if you were a Union soldier who had re-enlisted, you might get the opportunity to go home on furlough. But when you get home, you find that the people back there just don't understand. They can't imagine what you've seen. They still believe all you have to do is be brave and you would win this war. But you know better. So you go back to the people who do understand, your comrades in your regiment. For you, well, you may still believe in the cause, whatever that is, but now you're fighting for a different reason. You're fighting because your comrades need you, and you need them. You're now fighting for each other. You're fighting so that someday the war will come to an end, and that somebody will make it home. That is why you'll stay, even while you write your name on that piece of paper and sew it to your coat. Between 1861 and 1864, the war had become industrialized in all its brutal efficiency. The winners and the losers both shared in destruction, horror, and tragedy, although really there were no winners. Here, those who survived would never be the same. Here, there was no glory for anyone. Meanwhile, families back home would soon learn that they would never see their father, their son, or their brother ever again. Eventually, the war would come to an end. You would go home. If you were a Confederate soldier, the home you knew was gone. 2/3 of the Southern economy is gone. 10,000 farms are gone, and 1/4 of the military-age white men are dead and gone. If you were a black soldier, who was one of the 178,000 U.S. colored troops who served during the war, over 95,000 had been enslaved at the beginning of the war. You go back south, searching for family members and hoping for a new life. Initially, things were better, but by 1866, partly due to President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policies and the rise in violence and terror of the Ku Klux Klan, more Confederates were regaining political power. You find that things haven't changed that much, and in some ways, they're much worse. If you're a Union soldier, your side has won. There's going to be a big 2-day parade in Washington, D.C. Along the parade route, you'll see a huge banner that reads, "The only national debt we can never repay is the debt we owe our victorious Union soldiers." Unfortunately, you soon find out how short the nation's memory is and how little of that debt would be repaid. On your way home, you find that people fear and distrust you. Civilians wonder what the war has done to them and believe that it's turned you into a criminal, a rapist, or a murderer. It was usually the former soldiers who needed to fear the civilians. Veterans were often cheated, robbed, and even murdered for their back pay, bonuses, and pensions they had earned during the war. Many veterans lived productive lives after the war, but many did not. At least 500,000 men had been wounded during the war. Many would go home without arms or legs and discover finding a way to support their families was difficult, if not impossible. In 1866, the state of Mississippi would spend 1/5 of its state budget on artificial limbs for its veterans. And there were high rates of unemployment among veterans. As one former Confederate soldier put it, a carpenter with 2 hands always gets more work than a carpenter with only 1. Divorce and suicide rates among veterans would skyrocket compared to the general population. Alcoholism was so commonplace that by the 1870s, it was called the old soldier's disease. It appears that maybe as many as 40,000 former soldiers suffer from what we now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. They would spend their lives in and out of insane asylums. Their families would not know what to do with them. After the war, federal and state governments established a pension system for veterans. However, the system was so difficult to navigate that many veterans received little or no pension at all. The pensions were small and never enough to truly help. Many civilians considered veterans as moochers, bums, and freeloaders. Civilians had put the Civil War behind them. They didn't want to think about the war or what it had meant, and veterans were symbols of a past many Americans had already forgotten. In the 3.5 decades after the war, America went through rapid and unbelievable changes they could not have imagined in 1861. There were factories and railroads everywhere. New inventions like the light bulb, typewriter, the telephone, and motion pictures. In Boston, you could buy an orange that had been picked from a tree in Florida just a few days earlier. Lumber from Wisconsin was building homes on the Great Plains, while skyscrapers were going up in New York City, Chicago, and San Francisco. At the same time, there's a great deal of corruption in business and politics. Some things never change. The first Americans became millionaires while millions lived in poverty. There were labor strikes that were sometimes rudely put down, and sharecropping that was only a step away from slavery. There was the Great Depression of 1873, and another depression in 1893, both of which would last for years, would hit veterans very hard. At the same time America was changing, millions of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Mexico, China, Japan, Southern and Eastern Europe were flooding the country. And even small cities and towns, you could hear dozens of languages that were not your own. These turbulent changes would affect every part of American society. By the 1890s, a whole generation of Americans had grown up with no memory of the Civil War. They were frightened and confused by these changes that had taken place in their country. They began to look back and romanticize these veterans of the war, whom they had ignored, despised, and forgotten for so many years. With no memory of the war and its causes and costs, the general public made a conscious effort to reconcile the North and the South. However, while the general public was happy to reconcile and forget a war they had never known, these veterans could never really do that. These men of the armies of the blue and gray would march together on Decoration Day and on 4th of July parades and shake hands at the 50th and 75th anniversaries of the Battle of Gettysburg. These public displays were often manufactured events, staged by people who had not experienced the war themselves. They often did not represent the true feelings of veterans, could not forget the causes they had fought for, the comrades who never came home. And many veterans, even in their later years, were still bitterly hostile towards their former enemies. And once the parades were over, very real problems of veterans were forgotten by the public. In 1941, last Confederate veteran, Pleasant Crump, he served in the 10th Alabama at Petersburg, enlisted when he was 16 years old, surrendered at Appomattox, would pass away in Anniston, Alabama. In Duluth, Minnesota, in 1956, the last Union veteran, last Civil War veteran, Albert Wilson, who had been a drummer boy in the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery Regiment, joined his comrades in death. With Albert Wilson's death, these men, and a few women, would fade into history. Today there's a tendency to view these Civil War soldiers as one-dimensional characters who only existed in a certain time and in a certain place as soldiers. We go to reenactments and living history events, and we watch movies and documentaries, believe that's who they were. That's not who they were. For the last hour, I've been trying to describe to you what their lives were like. There's no way I can really do that. I haven't even come close. I think we've gotten used to a sanitized version of the Civil War. There's several reasons for that, but I think the primary reason is we've become attracted to the spectacle of the whole thing. Watch movies and television shows about the Battle of Gettysburg. We go to reenactments and we think this is what war is really like. Like the drama of Little Round Top and pageantry of Pickett's Charge with its stirring music, but we don't see the actual grim reality of war and its aftermath. What we see and only experience at a distance is not war. It's not even close. The real experience of war are things that are never portrayed on television or at a reenactment. the smell of dead bodies, the pools of blood, parts of bodies, and dismembered and unrecognizable human beings, things that no normal person would ever want to see. You don't see the fear, the depression, the grief, the hopelessness that these men sometimes felt. Or would we want to? There's no way we can really imagine what it's like to eat the same bad food day after day after day, march mile after mile on dusty roads in the hot summer sun, in clouds of dust. There's no way to comprehend seeing not just a few, but many of your friends go into the hospitals with disease. Never see them come back again. See fathers, brothers, sons, friends and neighbors being killed all around you in a matter of minutes. See others mangled in the most horrific ways and wonder when it will be your turn. There's no way to understand their hardships, and also their camaraderie, because these men, it wasn't all bad. There's no stories I can tell you, no reenactments you can go to, no movie you can watch can even come close to what these men experienced, what they saw themselves. It's beyond our imagination. Fortunately, it's outside of our experience. These were people that lived lives before the war, during, and after the Civil War. They weren't mannequins wearing uniforms. They were more than weapon systems they carried, more than uniforms they wore. Nor were they stoic victims who felt no fear or pain while they laid on an operating table. These were real people. Some of them were heroes. Some of them were cowards. Some were villains, and some were just unlucky. But most were just ordinary people like you and me. They had parents, children of their own, wives, maybe a girl waiting for them back home. They had occupations and businesses, relatives and friends and neighbors. They had hopes, dreams, plans for the future, many of which were cut short. They could not have imagined it in 1861. But for many of these men, the Civil War is the most important event of their lives. It would forever define who they were, how they saw themselves, how the rest of America that grew up after the war saw them, and how we still see them today. I want to thank you for coming out here this evening. If you have any questions, I'll stick around, but thank you very much for coming to Gettysburg. Thanks.
Thank you. You liked it.